All right. Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to the 2021 Virtual Hunger and Health Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Stephanie Dorfman, the Executive Director of Feeding Wisconsin. And for those who may not know, Feeding Wisconsin is the state association of our 6 regional member food banks that provide food to almost 1,000 local food programs, many of which are in the audience today. Our mission and work of Feeding Wisconsin is to help food banks, partners, and the general public end hunger, improve health, and strengthen local communities. Together, Feeding Wisconsin's network provided 79 million pounds of food to Wisconsinites in every corner of the state in 2020. And that was a 62% increase over 2019. After rescheduling three different rescheduling attempts and an in-person summit during the pandemic, I'm so glad that we can be here today, even if only virtual. It will be difficult not to ground our forum discussions in the context of the pandemic and the necessary pandemic relief work that so many of us contributed to. It's been with cross-sector partnerships that we were able to meet this crisis head-on, overcoming the perfect storm of supply chain disruptions, decreased food donations, and increased need. Of course, healthcare and public health partners were and still are overwhelmed with the public health crisis, and elected officials and advocates have also been busy. We've seen in real time the impact of policy when policy works to support improvements such as flexibilities, improving adequacy of benefits, and providing funding for basic and social needs. It has the ability to stabilize the lives of individuals and families. Those public safety nets alongside emergency food were and still are essential to keeping folks afloat during the pandemic. The network and so many frontline pantries, meal sites, school nutrition professionals, healthcare workers, and other nonprofits and programs took up a heavy task of ensuring that all Wisconsinites had the opportunity to access free and nutritious food, healthcare, and other resources despite the economic crisis. I can't help but take a moment to thank you all for participating today and in the role that you play to support those in your community. I'm also certain that the conversations to come over these 4 days of forum will be stories of individuals and organizations working to do better despite the tough times. With struggle came opportunity. We worked in partnership not only to end situations of hunger for individuals and families, but in the middle of the pandemic, we also prioritized living our values. The theme for the forum is Impact Through Courageous Collaboration. This was the theme that was set for April 2020. That didn't happen, and it's the theme that has only resonated more with me over time. When I think of impact, specifically through thinking about food and health equity work that we do, we're just scratching the surface. As we dig into our own diversity, equity, inclusion work and better situate ourselves as partners and allies, we're doing better to spend time listening to and working as a supportive actor with community in order to build programs and services that truly meet community needs. Now more than ever, we are considering our work through a food equity lens. We're working to ensure that the food we're distributing, the policies that we're advocating for, and the programs that we're implementing are addressing issues of hunger across communities in equitable ways. When I speak to food equity, specifically to the work that food banks do, I mean that we're working to source culturally meaningful food, to source dietary specific foods, to ensure that all individuals have access to foods that their bodies and their social selves need. We're not just working to get folks connected to food, but ideally to the right food for them. Most importantly, we're working in partnership with communities to find this community-based solutions to end hunger. But we have a long journey ahead on this work, and I've learned, especially through the pandemic, that in order to make the genuine impact that we'd like to end hunger, improve health, and strengthen communities, we need to work in partnership. To me, courageous collaboration means working in cross-sector partnerships, knowing that being vulnerable and without a scarcity mindset will help us be better. Courageous collaboration means engaging with those with lived experience and giving voice to community who might otherwise not be at the table. It means recognizing our own power as service providers, researchers, and other practitioners, and making space for others to occupy to find solutions that are meaningful to them. I believe that many of those here today have begun this work, and I know that we have a lot more engagement to do. I'm excited for the conversations ahead and the support that might support and motivate our efforts to create impact through courageous collaboration. So thank you all for joining us today. I'll share a bit of housekeeping before we move into the core of our conversation. So to begin with, please do hold dates for April 24th and through the 26th, 2022. We will be planning on having an upcoming in-person full Hunger and Health Summit at the Chula Vista in Wisconsin Dells. Our Hunger and Health Summits have always been a space for cross-sector conversation, where there's sharing of best practices and opportunities for strengthening partnerships. And we're trying our best in this virtual space to provide opportunities for networking and participant engagement. Today, we'll hear from Ending Hunger leaders and Dr. Monica White's keynote, Food Justice and Emergency Food, Building Bridges and Strategies Towards Community Wellness. We'll host a networking hour after from 12:30 to 1:30, where you can place yourself in a virtual networking room based on a topic that you're interested in. And next week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we'll hold 5 different panel conversations to help us dive more deeply into conversation and our work ahead. Please see our agenda for more details about those topics and also more information about the facilitators and panelists who will be leading those conversations. For all sessions, please use the chat. The chat is an opportunity to share your thoughts and questions where we might not have enough opportunity for your voices to be heard. Throughout this time, we also have an active Miro board. You can click on the discussion board feature on the left side of the virtual platform to contribute your thoughts in written format on a basically virtual board of Post-it notes. So please do go there if you prefer to engage in a written way. I also encourage you to edit your own profile. You can build connections and messages with other attendees using those 2 features. To the left of the virtual platform screen. There's a connections feature and a message feature. And if you ever get lost in the virtual platform, please see the platform overview feature for a how-to. I'm going to take 1 second to see if we have another special guest joining. Okay. So now it's with my great honor to announce Feeding Wisconsin's first Ending Hunger, Improving Health, and Strengthening Communities Lifetime Achievement Award. Today, we present this honor and our great appreciation to Kitty Kocol, Wisconsin's Department of Health Services TEFAP Administrator. Kitty has been a lifelong advocate for Wisconsin's children and families and has done so much to contribute to the economic well-being, health, and food security of Wisconsinites. For the last 10 years, Kitty has administered the Emergency Food Assistance Program, also known as TEFAP. It's with humility that at every possible opportunity, she shared her appreciation of pantries and shelters and meal sites that are on the front lines distributing that food. But much of this would not be possible without the efforts, the leadership, and the management of Kitty. Last year, Kitty led the TEFAP network through the immense shift that the pandemic forced upon food distribution. She has held the difficult role of drawing a line to ensure that food distribution was done safely, making those decisions as she held the pantry guests, volunteers, and frontline workers at the front of her mind. She has also supported the flexibilities and increased eligibility to ensure that more Wisconsinites had access to food and benefits during this difficult time. But Kitty is no stranger to tough work. Prior to her role administering TEFAP, Kitty worked on many fronts to support children and families who had experienced abuse and neglect. She was the executive director of Wisconsin Court-Appointed Special Advocates Association, or also known as CASA, administrator of the Division of Children and Families at DHS, executive director of the Office of Crime Victim Services at the State of Wisconsin Department of Justice, just to name a few of her many roles. Kitty's career has been one of persistence and support for those experiencing hardship. She has been a social justice advocate and a change maker, even while working from the inside of government. Over the years, Kitty has encouraged us to do better for Wisconsin families. In our hunger relief work, she encourages us to move to food distribution models that better serve individuals with dignity and respect and with choice. She has a way of operating from a lens of opportunity rather than scarcity. She thinks creatively and in partnership about how we can move resources across the state to more equitably serve those experiencing food insecurity. And above all else, I have been impressed at the way that she puts those experiencing hunger at the center of her work and decision-making. Kitty, I'm grateful for your service and your partnership, and I'm honored to present you with the Feeding Wisconsin, Ending Hunger, Improving Health, and Strengthening Communities Lifetime Achievement Award. Please join me in a virtual applause for Kitty Kocol and for her lifetime of service. I'm going to now queue up Kitty and Stan. Yes, Stan.
Okay. Greetings. My name is Stan Kocol. With great safety precautions, I'm visiting from Kentucky with my sister Kitty. Because she's got difficulty talking now, she asked me to deliver this message on her behalf. To the members and friends of Feeding Wisconsin, we know it takes commitment, planning, pluck, and muscle to feed a community. During the last 2 years, your volunteers and our food banks and CAP agencies have distributed roughly 3 times the amount of food to our families and households than we've done in prior years. That's a lot of food. And we've done that during a pandemic that isn't over yet. As a public servant focusing on hunger relief, my part in the last 10 years has been to foster connections between organizations, to try and anticipate need, get ahead of problems, and give folks clear guidance. Move resources as quickly as I could, and finally, I've tried to keep the bureaucracy manageable enough that we don't all trip over it. It's been my absolute honor to serve with you. My work is cut short by recurring cancer. Shooing out this unwelcome pest must be my primary focus. I've learned that many of you have struggled with this disease and survived. I hope to join you. Your good wishes, prayers, and notes kept me going the first time. If you feel like writing, I'd welcome it, though probably won't be able to respond. Please don't think everything needs to be serious. I enjoy the silly side of almost anything. Deep thanks to Feeding Wisconsin for this honor, and to Executive Director Stephanie Dorfman, who is building smart and strong connections on your behalf. Special thanks to colleagues Patty Habeck, Suzanne Becker for our successful food collaborations. They have terrific teams. And a final wink to Cassie Falks for tending to northeastern Wisconsin so very, very well. You all do brilliant work. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan, and thank you once again, Kitty. We are so grateful for the time that you spend with TEFAP and the efforts that you've made to end hunger for so many Wisconsinites. Now, I would like to welcome to the virtual stage Michelle Orgay, President and CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank of Southern Wisconsin and Vice President of Feeding Wisconsin's board. Cue up Michelle here. Michelle, you're on.
Hello, everyone. I have the pleasure of teeing up a video welcome from Claire Babineaux-Fontenot, who is the CEO of Feeding America. And while not the only ones doing great work and courageously collaborating in this space, Feeding America is the nationwide network of 200 food banks and 60,000 food pantries and meal programs. Yesterday, Claire visited 2 Feeding America food banks, and one was Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin at their Milwaukee location, and she visited us here in Madison at Second Harvest Food Bank of Southern Wisconsin. Claire's had a successful career as an attorney and in the corporate world before taking on this role at Feeding America, and I could share more about this, but instead I'd like to tell you about how she made our team feel yesterday. She spent time with us and she was present. She listened to us, she asked questions, she thanked every single person that she encountered. She looked everyone in the eyes and made everyone feel individually appreciated and seen. She answered questions honestly. She was authentic, and she was just genuinely appreciative for everything that had been done and everything that had been gone through in this past couple of years. She was really appreciative of the work of our partners, and she was really humble. But more than anything, it was clear that her focus is on those who are facing hunger. It was an inspiring visit for everyone, and it got everyone even more excited about launching into this Hunger and Health Forum. I would like nothing more than to just launch into the video so you can experience a little bit of Claire for yourselves. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Claire Babineaux-Fontenot, and it's my great privilege to serve as CEO of Feeding America. If you're seeing my face and are listening to the sound of my voice, that means that you have a very important distinction. You are a part of the Feeding America network. Whether you are an agency partner, a policymaker, a concerned citizen, we together are an important and vibrant part of the anti-hunger movement. We probably agree that certain things are simply unacceptable. That in the richest country in the history of civilization, there's no reason why we should throw away over 72 billion pounds of perfectly edible food each year, not counting household waste, while tens of millions of people struggle to find enough to eat. You've decided to be a part of the solution. My first and most important responsibility today is to say thank you. Thank you to every single one of you for every single thing that you've done to invest in our work, to invest in your communities. I wish I could tell you that the work is over, but it's not. Unfortunately, this work will be a marathon, not a sprint. We're going to continue to need your help. We're going to need you to come to the table of co-creation with an attitude that focuses all of your meaningful energy on solutions that will help people facing hunger. We're going to need together as a community to put aside all the things that might separate us and to focus intently on the things that bring us together. So thank you, one. Thank you all, not only for what you've already done, but for what you're preparing to do next. Your whole nation appreciates you, and I know that I certainly do.
We just wanted to spend all week with her. She was really inspiring. So thank you. And now for some more inspiration, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Monica M. White. Dr. Monica M. White is an award-winning scholar and currently serves as an associate professor of environmental justice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She holds a joint appointment in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology and the Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies. She is the first Black woman to earn tenure in both the College of Agricultural Life Sciences and the Nelson Institute at UW-Madison. Her research investigates Black, Latinx, and Indigenous grassroots organizations that are engaged in the development of sustainable, community-based food systems as a strategy to respond to issues of hunger and food inaccessibility. As a founding director of the Office of Environmental Justice and Engagement at UW-Madison, she works to bridge the gap between the community and the university and its resources by connecting community-based organizations that are working on areas of environmental, food, and land justice to faculty and students. Her first book, Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement, was released in January 2019. It received the 2019 Eduardo Bonilla Silva Outstanding Book Award from the Division of Race and Ethnic Minorities section of the Society of Study of Social Problems. Freedom Farmers revises the historical narrative of African American resistance and breaks new ground by including the work, roles, and contributions of Southern Black farmers and the organizations they formed. Moreover, it provides a historical foundation that will add meaning and context for current conversations regarding the resurgence of agriculture in the context of food justice and sovereignty movements in urban spaces like Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, New York City, and New Orleans. We are grateful to Dr. Monica White for being with us today in this virtual setting. As we plan for her keynote to be presented at our April 2020 rescheduled Hunger and Health Summit, this conversation is long overdue. We now welcome Dr. Monica White presenting her keynote, Food Justice and Emergency Food, Building Bridges and Strategies Toward Community Wellness.
Hi, and thank you, Michelle. Thank you also to Stephanie, to Rolisa, to everyone who contributed to my being here today. Truly grateful for the work that you all do, and those that are listening. Thank you for your decades of commitment to feeding families. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to share with you some ideas on how we might all join forces to provide nutrient-rich foods, building toward community wellness. Slide. I always start my presentation. Slide. Thank you. I always start my presentations by acknowledging my grandma Pearl and my granddaddy Kenneth. Both were farmers in Eden, North Carolina. Michelle mentioned my book, and it was just sort of serendipitous that I had written a book about Black farmers and agricultural cooperatives. My grandparents were farmers, but I didn't know that my granddaddy was one of the founders of an agricultural cooperative. And so I always like to acknowledge them and their commitment to feeding community and feeding themselves. Slide. I want to just talk a bit about, if you're interested in reading more about the scholarship that I've done, there are several pieces that you can refer to. Freedom Farmers is the book that we published. I also wrote a piece on Black agriculture and the origins of food justice that talks about how Detroit has responded to the COVID crisis. D-Town Farm, African American Resistance to Food Insecurity and the Transformation of Detroit, concentrates on the work of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and D-Town Farmers. And also Sisters of the Soil, Urban Gardening as Resistance in Detroit is also republished in a new edition just last year called Black Food Matters. I know a lot about food justice. You know a lot about emergency food. So it is my hope that we're going to be able to come together. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the ways that communities, particularly Mrs. Hamer and Freedom Farms Cooperative in Ruleville, Mississippi in the late 1960s, responded to food insecurity and food access in the South. And I'm also going to give you an example of an organization that I've worked with in Detroit, Earthworks Urban Farm, to talk about some ways that we might think about building bridges and working together. Slide, please. To collect the data for my book, first I started in the urban ag movement in Detroit. Just wanted to sort of see what was happening, what was going on. I participated in a lot of presentations, workshops, but did a lot of growing, a lot of food distribution and what have you. I started in Detroit to understand how Detroiters were responding to food access and insecurity. But what was also important to me was not just how Detroiters were using this moment to grow food, but also what were the antecedents? What were the other times when African Americans had turned to our agriculture roots as a strategy of resistance and resilience? So in order to collect the data, I had both a historical and a contemporary analysis. I spent a lot of time in the archives and looked at secondary sources. And probably the part that's most fun to me is using contemporary examples with semi-structured interviews with generational Black farmers, food activists, and growers. So I would spend the day in the archives, and at night I would hang out with very cool farmers, both rural and urban, in the South and the North, young and the elders. Slide. For that project, I was really interested in what are the contributions of farmers to the Black freedom struggle and the civil rights movement. I was really asking questions like, how do Black farmers see themselves as agents intervening in the food system for their own and their community's best interests? I was asking questions like, what strategies do farmers use in order to achieve a healthy, sustainable, community-based food system? Slide. So the research process, as I mentioned, I started in Detroit. I hung out at every food-related event to try to get a sense of what was happening, what was the landscape. I found and fell in love with Baba Malik Yakini of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and all the work that they're doing in Detroit to really sort of increase access to nutrient-rich food. There's a 7-acre organic farm working on the Detroit People's Food Co-op, and so many initiatives that engage community as a way to build a sustainable food system. They taught me the language of food justice and food sovereignty. That was not something that I had classes in graduate school. And also what I heard in at those tables made me want to sort of look at a different lens to understand the history of African Americans in agriculture. We know that often we hear about slavery, tenant farming, and sharecropping, but I knew that if that was all there was, then that wouldn't explain why African Americans repeatedly turn back to agriculture historically when times get tough. In order to do an analysis of African Americans in agriculture, you cannot do so without talking about Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee University. George Washington Carver, who I argue is the founder of organic agriculture, even though people often talk about and mention Rodale was 50 years later. And Du Bois, who talks about agricultural cooperatives and the importance of collectively pulling our resources together, our economics together as a strategy to build safety and security no matter what. So I call them the 3 wise men, but I also talk about Fannie Lou Hamer as the sister who showed them how to do it. And so I'll talk a little bit about her later on. Slide. What I learned was that people were using agriculture as a strategy of resistance and resilience, particularly African Americans, especially in Detroit. What do I mean by that? While we often talk about protest marches and boycotts, these are energies or efforts that are against those who people believe stand between them and accessing nutrient-rich food. But when I saw folks growing food, and I even heard about it through history, that folks were growing food as a way to provide resources to themselves that had been further from which they had been excluded, I saw that as a strategy that had not been captured by the literature. So we can talk about protests that are disruptive. We can talk about non-disruptive, such as boycotts. We can talk about gendered strategies, women using our spheres of influence to add to the political conversation and discussion. But I argue through the data that I've collected, I created a theoretical framework of community resilience and collective agency that talks about a community that uses agriculture to increase access to nutrient-rich foods, but not just one, right? There were several organizations, several agricultural cooperatives that were engaged in similar kinds of activities. And what do I mean by that? Here's a quote from Mrs. Hamer slide. One of the reasons I love Mrs. Hamer so much is not only was she talking about accessing the right to vote, she also talked about hunger as a strategy of oppression and then provided a response to it using Freedom Farm as a strategy of freedom and liberation for the Black folks who lived and wanted to stay in Mississippi. So she says here, down in Mississippi, they're killing Negroes of all ages on the installment plan through starvation. If you're a Negro and vote, if you persist in dreams of Black power to win some measure of freedom in white-controlled counties, you go hungry. There is a way to fight back against this non-violent weapon of white officialdom. Next. Another way that she talks about hunger as oppressive, she says, nobody told us we have to move from Mississippi. Nobody tells us when we're not wanted. But when you're starving, you know, where a couple of years ago, white people were shooting at Negroes trying to register and vote. Now they say register, then you'll starve. Sorry about that. And so I think that looking at Mrs. Hamer's work and efforts as articulating hunger as a strategy of oppression, we see organizations today looking at providing food as a strategy of community health and wellness that I think is particularly important. After I collected the data from several organizations across time, I created a theoretical framework that you can see at the next slide called Community Resilience and Collective Agency. Collective agency, agency is often studied as a slide. Thank you. Agency is often thought of as a psychological construct. We often think about people making the decision to do something to transform their lives. But when you talk about a community or a community farm or community garden or growing space or some of these initiatives that we see happening in cities today, we see this agency taking on a collective form. So I thought it was important to add that component. Often we think about resilience as a response to a catastrophic event, and we recognize that people do tremendous things after or during the face of catastrophe. But I also think it's irresponsible if we talk about resilience without interrogating and analyzing the conditions that create certain kinds of crises. So collective agency and community resilience, these are activities that several organizations, historically and contemporary organizations, are involved in. And I see them using and implementing three different strategies. One is called prefigurative politics. In the conditions where people are unable to vote or unable to participate in the political process, we see in the organizations the creation of free spaces for political discussion, political education, and also self-management. Economic autonomy and independence, we see organizations trying to find ways to create an exchange of currency that doesn't necessarily have to include the dollar. So we see individuals individuals going from an individual perspective to a collective, moving from the oppressive to the liberatory. And then in terms of commons as praxis, we see the decisions that are made by the shared resources and spaces as being both collective, but also regenerative, opposed to extractive. So let's talk a little bit about one of my favorite people ever, Mrs. Hamer. Mrs. Hamer is often recognized as someone who talked about being sick and tired of being sick and tired. And people talk about her contributions to African Americans' right to vote. But what many people don't know is that she started Freedom Farm Agricultural Cooperative. What other folks don't know, many folks don't know, was that there was a very strong connection between Madison, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and Ruleville, Mississippi, and Mrs. Hamer. Just the tremendous amounts of work that she was able to do on behalf of those who were hungry. Slide. At the beginning of Freedom Farm, they started a pig bank. And the pig bank was a pig bank. They were like celebrities. They call them sunflower pigs. But they had been given 50 pigs from the National Council of Negro Women, and the pigs were used to supplement, to provide food and supplement their income. They would receive a pregnant pig, and once the pig had the babies, the piglets, then the babies would go back to the bank and then would be generated throughout the community. They eventually, one year, they provided resources for over 300 families. The next slide is the land, the invoice from the property for Freedom Farms. And Freedom Farm was 680 acres. They had a commercial kitchen, they had food preservation, they had all kinds of resources that were provided for people. And so when folks are asking the question in urban spaces now, why is this new? The argument is no. Mrs. Hamer and several others have been doing this kind of collective food resource for very many years as strategies toward food justice. They also had other kinds of cooperatives, like the next slide. They had sewing cooperatives. They had a leathersmithing cooperative. Some would argue that the origins of a catfish farming actually started with Mrs. Hamer and Freedom Farms. And so we know how important accessing food, nutrient-rich food is. But we also know that accessing nutrient-rich food also leads to other kinds of resources and questions that come in that are important. And so this next slide demonstrates the power of the agricultural cooperative. Not only did they grow food, but they also provided housing. This was some of the housing that was provided through tenant farming and sharecropping. And the next slide shows that she had developed 100 acres for low-income housing, high quality and affordable housing. And the next slide will show you what houses that Mrs. Hamer actually built. The next slide is important because these instruments, the tractor, they had a tool bank, they had farm managers, they grew subsistence crops and cash crops to pay the mortgage. They had contracts with Atkins Pickles. But this tractor actually was funded by Measure for Measure, a progressive organization out of Madison. And I met folks who were active with Measure for Measure, who met and had Mrs. Hamer in their home. So this relationship has always been very rich and very beautiful. So I'm just thinking about, just using this as an example of how a community came together to respond to food access and food access, and was doing so in such a way that there are also ways that we can think about how to talk about it as it relates to emergency food. This next picture is an image of Mrs. Hamer in the commercial kitchen. 10% of what they grew went into the food bank. They had community gardens, food preservation, food preparation courses. They did collective purchases. Thousands and thousands of food went to the vegetable bank. The cash crops were sold. The next slide. I think what Mrs. Hamer was really working toward was building resilient communities. And if we're talking and thinking about food, how can you talk and think about food, growing food especially, without talking about land access? How can we talk about land without talking about quality education? How can we talk about education without employment? How do we talk about that without safety and security, transportation, housing, and healthcare? And I think this political moment gives us the opportunity to really think about these, how they intertwine, how they interact with each other, but also how food is essential. Just by way of covering a couple of terms, just to make sure that we're all using the same language. The next slide. What is food security? And you probably already know, but the United Nations Committee describes food as meaning all people at all times have access, social and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy lifestyle. Well, food security is one aspect and element that we're working toward, but yet issues talking and thinking about food sovereignty, which is the next slide, is what the food movement is working toward. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy, culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, consume food at the heart of food systems and policies rather than demands of markets and corporations. And the next slide, a basic definition of what food justice is. It's communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. One example of a way in which emergency food meets food justice is an organization that I've worked with, Earthworks Urban Farm. Next slide, please. Their motto is they seek to build a just, beautiful food system through education, inspiration, community development as a working study in both social justice and knowing the origins of the food we eat. Earthworks strives to restore our connection to the environment and community. Beautiful people doing incredible work in the and it was started as a vision in the late 90s. Brother Rick decided that it was important not only to provide for the soup kitchen and the pantry nutrient-rich food, but also wanted to, in the city of Detroit, actually grow the food that then would be sold and not sold, but provided in the soup kitchen and what have you. And so it was just a beautiful vision that is now developed into about 2.5 acres. They are probably the only certified organic farm in Detroit, but what they do isn't only important, it's also how and why they do it. Next slide. They provide starts for all kinds of folks, all kinds of farms and projects in the city. But this is just an example of not only doing for themselves, doing for their patrons, but doing for the community. 2.5 acres, as I mentioned. They grow, next slide, under the banner of Grown in Detroit. Grown in Detroit is produce that's been grown by family gardens, community gardens, and urban farms in Detroit, Highland Park, and Hamtramck. So if you've ever been to the Eastern Market, which is one of the oldest Eastern Market open air markets in the country, there are lots of folks who buy wholesale, but sell retail. But the Grown in Detroit banner is one of the ways in which it's a cooperative of all kinds of folks that have come together and decided not to compete, but to work together and to collaborate. And Earthworks is a part of that. Next slide. They do bees, which promote biodiversity and beneficial insects. Next slide. They have a community bike shop in a shipping container. Lots of folks in the city use biking as transportation, but they wanted to make sure that folks had the skills to repair the bikes, but also to learn how to do so. And the next slide, they do value-added products like honey, jams, and ham bombs as a way to both demonstrate and to teach how to use value-added, but also as a source of income. Well, why is Earthworks Urban Farm important? Why is it significant? The next slide, please. One, they do a tremendous job of engaging community. And you probably noticed that sometimes there's a big difference between those that are volunteers, those that are employees, and those who receive our services. And so what's important is to have these conversations where folks are able to talk to each other, to build together, and to work toward understanding each other in ways that I think food allows us to do. The second is that they really do assess the community needs. They want to know what are the needs in that immediate area, and how might we provide those resources that are helpful and necessary. After some of the work that we've done with members of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and Earthworks Urban Farm, they decided it was important for them to do a power analysis. Now, this power analysis was where they looked at who were the patrons, but who was the staff, and they wanted to see were there demographic differences between who was on paycheck, payroll, volunteers, and those who lived in the community. And they made some decisions that it was important for them to make a variety of hiring decisions that were more inclusive of some of the skills that aren't always captured by degrees. In other words, they would much rather have someone who knew the community, who knew the resources within the community, much more so than how many degrees or how many years of education, and those or how many different kinds of programs are they able to work. It was really important for them to do a power analysis, and I think that that was one of the most significant activities that they've done in terms of a staff analysis. So with all this information, they've also done community integration, and they have a commitment, a desire of working toward community empowerment. All of this work really demonstrates, I think, what is, we like to call this community-based food system. We know the food system, right? We know from production to processing, distribution, retail, preparation, eating. I would also add a slide that would talk about food rescue, of course, which you do, but also composting, what have you. So the outer slide, the outer circle, really shows how the food work integrated with community and agriculture can create a difference in our community, in our neighborhoods. So this is adding, not just talking about how the food was produced, but talking about it through the lens of environmental stewardship, not just talking about employment, but talking about economic development for a community, talking about jobs, talking about healthy people, community and social vitality, making sure that farmland is preserved, but also supporting small and medium scale farmers. Next slide. So I think emergency food is critical, right? Especially in this political moment. And how do we think about what resources we have while we're doing the important work of feeding families today? How might we move beyond food? What is beyond this kind of conversation of emergency food? And I just have a few suggestions for those of you that run organizations, just a few ideas of things that you might be able to consider as you go back and think about when, what is it that we need to create more community-based healthy food systems. One is an offer to do a community needs assessment. Often we're occupying communities, but we don't really have a clear sense of what communities need in addition to food. And so I think it'd be great if we could think about ways to facilitate conversations with patrons on how to better serve, right? How might we encourage leadership from our patrons? Another idea of moving beyond food might be asset mapping. When we look at our immediate neighborhood, we look at our city, when we look at our region, our state, what are some of the assets in those states, in those spaces? What are those assets and how might we align with them on those issues within which we share? I think a lot of times we're sort of myopic and just sort of thinking about this one thing. But I think as we widen the lens, we realize how many more folks are interested in this work under which one umbrella can be created so that we can move toward community health and wellness. And the last thing I want to offer is an idea that you might think about doing some creative visualization. Thinking about your staff, your faculty, having leadership conversations, your boards, asking yourself, really, who do we serve? I think I've had students who've done some work in soup kitchens and pantries, and my students came back very surprised by the folks who benefited from pantries and kitchens. And it really challenged what they thought they knew about who really needs resources and food services. The other question in this creative visualization would be, who is in our social network and who are the folks with whom we can align as we work toward creating a community food system that feeds and nourishes everyone? And the other is, how might we be able to support others? I think one idea that I've heard about was a soup kitchen that allowed their commercial kitchen to be used by urban farmers who lived in the neighborhood. They allowed their vans to be used, of course, with the proper protocol. But what I thought was so interesting and so important was that they were allies and really uniting with the food justice organizations in effort to provide to share what the resources they had with organizations that were also trying to do similar kinds of work to make sure that folks were fed. And so I just have a few pictures that show just the beauty of not only food production, but the reason that we're doing this work. Next slide. Oh, sorry, forgot that slide. Ooh, wait, okay, okay. So where is the connection? Sorry about that. Thank you, Stephanie. What are the community-based organizations doing around us? What models exist for us to expand our relationships? And how might we use our resources to support community-led initiatives? Next slide. I think these are the folks that we're doing this work for. We want the next generation to have access to nutrient-rich food. Next slide. Next slide. Baby Nakaya, the next slide. These are the people, the children is the next generation of folks who want to make sure have nutrient-rich food. If you're interested at all in some of the future work that I'm doing, next slide. I'm currently working on a Paris family biography. It's the Paris family. The elder Paris was the first Black USDA loan officer, and his 3 generations just have done tremendous work for over 100 years. I'm interested in, started a Black Anglers project, the idea started sitting in Madison's Lakeside coffee shop, watching folks fish, wondering what they're fishing for, how they use the fish, and what does fishing do, both culturally but historically. As Michelle mentioned, have started the Office of Environmental Justice and Engagement that allows community organizations to have a space and a place to trust academics to help them understand their specific kinds of questions that they're engaging in. And I'm actually headed today to Tallahassee, Florida, as we're beginning to start a Center for Agroecology at a historically Black college, Florida A&M University. And that focuses on student education, agricultural education, and also resources for Black farmers. And I thank you. I hope we have some time for questions.
We do have time for questions. Please do add any questions that you might have in the chat.
Oh, if you want to just sort of share what it is that, if there are ways that you all are working with food justice organizations or ideas, let's talk about that.
I'll jump in and ask one for you, Monica. I think you touched on, I appreciate the next steps that you provided to folks who are interested in engaging more deeply. I'm wondering if you have an initial, if folks are really starting on the ground of doing this, what is one thing they can do quickly and easily and in partnership to get going on thinking through the lens of food justice in their own communities?
One is to identify who are the food justice organizations in the community, right? And I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap. It just needs us to start the conversation. So one is to identify who are the folks that are doing this work, what work are they doing, and then what ways might we be able to align. I think that's one of the first things I would think would be helpful. And how do you define a food justice organization may also be something that folks are struggling with. And it doesn't have to be an organization that defines themselves as food justice. It could be a church's wellness ministry. It could be another entity that exists in like the Urban League or NAACP or any of the other sort of community organizations, wellness programs, or schools. Like in Madison, we have Badger Rock. And so I just think that there are lots of folks that are working on food, and emergency food is absolutely essential. We need that. So I'm not saying stop doing what you're doing. What I'm saying is how might we broaden the umbrella and share our initiatives along and between amongst those of us that are doing this work around food to see if there are ways that we could collaborate.
One other thing that's been on my mind is I think we are all so mission and purpose driven in our work. And I appreciated your examples of how interwoven social issues are. We know that folks need some support on the food end, but we also know that housing, especially right now in the situation and the situation we're in, is a major need for folks experiencing hardship. And I think something that's been on my mind is not the fact that we have to do everything for everyone, but that is the purpose of partnership. So how are we doing better together by connecting with other partners in our communities to provide some wraparound assistance for folks. I'm wondering if there's anything more you'd want to elaborate on that.
Well, one, food is not the panacea, right? It's not the answer to everything, but it is a critical component. I do think that, as I mentioned with Earthworks Urban Farm, there are so many ways that they included, issues of environmental sustainability and stewardship, providing the bicycle program as a source of transportation, but also as a response to a lack of access. I think that we have to be creative, right? I think that the issues are so intertwined and interconnected that we have to be creative in ways that we can come together and to build. And I think that having the will to do so is the first step. And so I don't know, your question was, how do you go about establishing those relationships?
Building those cross-sector partnerships to provide sort of wraparound services without drifting from your own mission.
Yeah, I think it is a matter of collaboration and engaging in those kinds of conversations that give folks, I mean, of course you don't want, stepping on toes, but also understanding that we're much better together. I feel like, understanding that and realizing that the essential nature of an ecosystem means that we all have a separate part, but we all work together. And how might we do that in a more sustainable way, but also in a way that provides a greater amount of options and opportunities with the limited resources that we have.
Keeping an eye on the chat here. Any other questions or thoughts? All right. Well, Monica, any other last words on your end?
No, as I said, and when I started, I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to come and talk to you. I'm grateful for the work that you all are doing. And if there are ways that we can collaborate, I look forward to it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you bearing with us through this long haul of getting connected and getting your voice on our stage. We appreciate your words and motivation to move forward in this work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. So with that, I'm going to first let Monica step away. And a few more housekeeping notes. We are ahead of schedule, but that's okay. That's great. We can move things right along. We do have a networking hour. Let's jump right in. At the close of this, once I end this stream, you'll be able to go and click on networking rooms. You can do so by clicking on the networking rooms feature to the left of the stream that you're watching. And then you'll be able to opt into any conversation that you're interested in. You'll be able to jump in and out of conversations as you like. Of course, sticking with a conversation is always helpful to get to know others in the room. And you'll be able to use the chat in there and also have a Zoom-like experience chatting with others. So we'll move over there, and I'll also once again encourage you to go to the discussion boards feature and contribute to our Miro board. Also edit your profile, make connections, and send messages to other attendees who you may be interested in connecting with. So with that, thank you once again to Monica, thank you to Michelle, and thank you again to Kitty Kocol. I appreciate you all being here today and sharing in the conversations ahead. So feel free to jump over to the networking rooms at this time, and we'll be in those virtual networking rooms for the next hour between noon and 1 o'clock. Thank you.